Welcome to Hub Dialogues. I'm your host, Sean Speer, editor-at-large at the Hub. We have something special for you this week. I was recently grateful to speak with best-selling author and longtime journalist Sam Tanenhaus about his much-anticipated biography of William F. Buckley Jr. entitled Buckley, The Life and Revolution That Changed America. As listeners and viewers may know, I'm a big fan of Bill Buckley, and so you can imagine that I had a lot of questions for Tanenhaus, who spent more than 2 decades producing the book. So we have a two-part dialogue for you. Part one covers Buckley's family life, career trajectory, and animating ideas and values. It ends with interesting details about his search for a successor. Part two, which will be released tomorrow, covers Buckley the man, including his penchant for fun and friendship, his closest relationships, and how we should understand him in a fast-evolving context of media, politics, and ideas. The next voice you'll hear is mine in conversation with Sam Tanenhaus for part one of our dialogue about William F. Buckley Jr.'s life and legacy. Sam, thanks for joining us at Hub Dialogues, and congratulations on the book.
Oh, my pleasure. Glad to be here, Sean.
The book has been a long time in the making, of course, and the amount of work that you put into it, including Buckley's extensive archives, interviews with those close to him, even chasing down those who weren't, is rather extraordinary. I wondered as I was reading it, I wondered if I was reading it, Sam, did you have a working hypothesis when you started the project? And if so, how did it evolve over time?
You asked a big question there because I did. I started working on this book just not long after I'd finished a previous biography of Whittaker Chambers, famous ex-communist witness whom Buckley had been very close to.
Yes.
So I started on this one in 1998, and America and Buckley in 1998. Well, Bill Clinton is president, but we're really living in kind of the post-Reagan era. Communism has been defeated. Bill Buckley was the most articulate and ardent crusader for that cause. I thought this book was going to be about the intellectual who'd done more than any other to win the great moral crusade of his time. Yes. Then history intervened. And listen, that's why you write the books. I mean, not only to revisit the past, but to see how the past feels when time marches on. And yes. America became a different place. The world became a different place. And Bill Buckley, in retrospect, began to seem a different kind of figure, not yes. smaller, not less admirable, but also more complicated.
Yes. Amongst the major contributions you make is bringing new evidence to bear on Buckley's early life, his father's isolationism, anti-Semitism, anti-Protestantism, and so on. What really struck me, though, Sam, was the extent to which, notwithstanding the family's wealth, the Buckleys still stood outside the establishment of New York and Connecticut. To what extent did that sense of being an outsider shape Buckley's self-image and remain an enduring part of how he understood himself?
Oh, it's really the essence. Someone I've gotten to know quite well, a very good historian here in the U.S., Beverly Gage, wrote a great biography of J. Edgar Hoover, and his professor at Yale, and was a student there as Buckley was, said Buckley fascinates her because he's an inside-outside guy.
Yes.
His parents were devout Catholics from the South. He grew up in Yankee Protestant WASP, Connecticut. So there's already a kind of conflict there. His family were almost like a colony of Mexican aristocrats because his father had made his career in Mexico. English was Bill Buckley's third language. That's why he learned all those words to try to catch up. So he grew up in New England, and they're kind of outside the culture. That's why a key to this book, you talk about how the book evolved or changed over time, was getting outside the massive Buckley archive at Yale University and going down to Camden, South Carolina, where the family, when he was growing up, had its winter residence, a beautiful antebellum pre-Civil War mansion, and finding all the documentation there about how involved the family had been in promoting segregation in the South during the period of when the civil rights movement was arising, where the Buckleys stood in relation to that. It opened the story up in a very big way. And it emphasized yet again, Buckley was never completely inside. He joined every club, belonged to every club. He was connected, he was famous, he was wealthy, very attractive and articulate, but he was also just a little bit outside the true liberal establishment, a term invented in the pages of his magazine, by the way, National Review in the mid-50s.
Uh, one of the things you remind me about in the book is that Buckley himself never quite finishes a magnum opus on conservatism. He called himself at different times a conservative, a libertarian, a populist, a fusionist, and of course he had a hand in the Sharon Statement and was closely associated with Frank Meyer's project of fusionism. How should we characterize his ideology, Sam? Was he any of those things, or was he a combination? How do all these strands fit together in his mind?
I'd say all of them, Sean. And what I would say is the phrase of his from his very first book, and in some ways his most important book, God and Man at Yale, published right after he graduated, 1951. He called himself a radical conservative.
Hmm.
And in the first issue of National Review, the magazine he founded in 1955, really to keep alive the legacy of Joseph McCarthy, believe it or not, or at least keep alive that crusade. In that first issue, November 19th, 1955, Buckley says it, radical conservatives are having a hard time of it. And I couldn't wrap my mind around that expression
Hmm.
because we think of conservatives as preservers, not as radicals who want to uproot. So what's
Yes.
the answer there? The answer is if liberalism seems to you a kind of secular or religion, it's so embedded in the culture that there's a kind of continual revolution that's taken place in your own society. Well, the only way you're going to defeat it is to pull it up by the roots, is to
Hmm.
be a kind of radical. And I was still uneasy with the expression until I interviewed Buckley's closest and longest time friends, Henry Kissinger, who
Hmm.
came out of a different world. His was the world of geopolitical strategy, of super realism, set aside all moral considerations, right? Great power struggles, all these things, 19th century, very different from Buckley. And he invited me to lunch to talk about Buckley, whom he adored. And when he described Buckley and company, he said, well, of course, then you have the radical conservatives. And I thought, my gosh, that's the phrase they used.
Hmm.
That's what the Harvard educated Henry Kissinger used as the category for Buckley. So I would say then, you take those strands, are libertarian, as far as economics go, they want the government there just to kind of help big business along, keep the regulation and taxation low. Not so different from what you have in Canada and your Tories there, or a friend of ours like David Frum is all for that. But they also have a social conservative aspect. They want to preserve the family values. A lot of Catholicism in Bill Buckley's case, and we know what values are attached to that. Anti-abortion and sexuality and marriage, all those things as they develop. Buckley was very conservative. But the main thing that brought them all together was defeating that liberal enemy, the ones that had corrupted the culture, in his view. And culture is really important because when people ask me, you say, well, Buckley's the intellectual leader of the conservative movement, but he didn't write a great book, as you say. So I tell them, well, it's one thing to be an intellectual leader. It doesn't mean you have to be a leading intellectual. There are
Hmm.
other people who can come up with the arguments and ideas. Buckley was very good at expressing them, right? Summarizing them. But the main thing he was able to do was to build the movement
Hmm.
through the force of his personality, his style, his charisma, his wit, his charm. He's an incredibly ingratiating person, is to pull all these different people together and tell them, whatever we disagree about, here's the thing we want to do. We want to beat the other side. It's interesting. I'm just reading one of my heroes is Gary Wills. Has got a book called,
Yes.
and he was a protege of Buckley's. He's got a book called Certain Trumpets, different styles of leadership. And just before you and I started talking, I was reading his pages on Socrates, and Will's a classical scholar. And he says Socrates argued to win, that all the ancient Greeks did. It was almost like battle, and Socrates had been quite a good warrior. You were there to win. You're there to prove the other side is wrong, and you're going to drag their corpse around, like in the Iliad. And Buckley had some of that. He wanted to win the argument, win the debate. On your terms, on his terms, on his turf, on your turf. He's going to go after you. It doesn't mean it always happened, right? The two most famous debates he had, he lost to
Yes.
James Baldwin and then Gore Vidal,
Yes.
but the public stage, and make it about language, argument, who can win. And so there he understood, since the conservatives of his own time, when he was growing up in the 1930s and 40s, were so much on the outs, the America of the New Deal and Franklin Roosevelt, that to be a conservative was kind of like a joke. There was a phrase, the thankless persuasion, right, for conservatives. For him to make it flashy and attractive and all that, he had to come in and be a different kind of guy. So that's where you get the cultural battle. And Buckley saw that's where it would be won or lost. It's still happening today, right? Universities fighting over the media elites. It never went away. Buckley was a pioneer of all
There are so many ways to take the conversation after that
that.
thoughtful answer. Maybe I'll jump on your reference to Willis, who you remind us in the book, although it was Buckley's Jr., was a bit of a mentor when it came to Catholicism. I asked about the different ideological impetuses that shape Buckley's public life. One of the key takeaways from the book is, I think, to understand Buckley's Catholicism is to understand Buckley himself. Why don't you talk a bit about the extent to which Catholicism really defined Bill Buckley?
He got a lot of it from his mother, and both his parents were devout Catholics. And I should add here, Sean, or really kind of lead into this by saying that although Catholics are obviously a minority in the United States, a very large one, it's the single biggest denomination by far. But it's a Protestant country, is that Buckley's mother was from New Orleans, Ellery Steiner Buckley, and his father was from South Texas, in what was really had been land owned by Mexico. It was won right during the Mexican War. So that means that Buckley grew up the son of parents who came from Catholic majority cultures, dominant
Mm,
culture. So his
mm,
idea of Catholicism is very different from, say, the Kennedys' idea. The Buckleys and the Kennedys were often seen as parallel families,
mm,
wealthy, handsome, lots of kids, Ivy League educations, powerful patriarchs who William F. Buckley Sr., Joseph Kennedy,
sure.
these self-made, very successful businessmen who raised these brilliant children. And the one difference was the Kennedys looked back to Ireland. The Buckleys did not. And I asked Bill Buckley about this early on, and he said, no, for us, the big things were Mexico, where his father had made his first fortune, and the South. So their Catholicism is of a different kind. It's very aristocratic Catholicism.
Mm,
So the home Buckley grew up in had, 16th century original Italian paintings of the Madonna, or these rare figurines of the Holy Family that his father had found in Mexico and brought home. So it's a very hierarchical idea of Catholicism. It's not the social justice argument.
yes.
Gary Wills, you mentioned as his protege, was much more a kind of social justice Catholic, and that's part of where the split came between those two. But Bill Buckley was not a learned Catholic. He had only 1 year of formal Catholic training when he went, typical of the Buckleys, to a very high-class boarding school in England, just for 1 year, right before the Second World War started. And then was brought back, went to secular schools the rest of the way. And brilliant though Bill Buckley was, he was not a deep or voracious reader. He read more than most people do, but he didn't read the way someone like Gary Wills did. So he was not that educated in Catholic doctrine or theology. What he did know was what he heard in church every Sunday. And that is the Catholicism of faith, hope, and charity, of kindness to strangers, of philanthropy, and of following the teachings of the church. And that's the Catholicism he lived out. So while he was the most famous Catholic intellectual in America, he was not the leading intellectual Catholic. We get back to that paradox again. It's
Yes.
really more a man of the church and of the faith. He said he never once questioned the true teachings of the church. That's what his original first writings came out of. His being shocked to hear professors at Yale ridicule the Eucharist, to treat the Sunday service, Sunday Mass, as if it were kind of anthropological ritual. It was shocking to him. It was the basis of his first writing.
Staying on the subject of paradox, a big part of your book and a big part of the National Review story is the relationship between ideology and politics. There were moments when Buckley faced real pressure, whether from Eisenhower or later presidents, to soften or adapt. Was National Review first and foremost an ideological project, or was it more political? And what was the balance between the two?
It was an ideological journal that wanted to influence politics. It's two dominant figures early on, apart from Buckley himself, who was the ringmaster of all this. You have to keep in mind, it's interesting to think about that the main figures at National Review early on were all 15 to 20 years older than Buckley. There were these elders he'd found, then brought together. Several of them had been communists. They were ex-communists, like Whittaker Chambers. So they have a kind of apocalyptic view of what politics should be, and also a belief that ideology is what really decides the course of politics. So when the magazine is first being published and the very non-ideological consensus Republican Eisenhower is in office, they really don't know what to do except to attack him. Then over time, as the magazine became more influential and as Buckley's own star continued to rise, as it did through his public appearances, his television program, which began in the 1960s, Firing Line, his own brilliant campaign for mayor of New York in 1965. As he became a celebrity and Buckley eased more into the establishment, he became more comfortable with establishment republicanism and then became the kind of conservative elder. So Richard Nixon, for instance, the first professional Republican, it was said, elected president since the days of Herbert Hoover, since Eisenhower had been kind of a stand-in, a general, popular hero, bring him in, maybe we can defeat the Democrats for once. With Nixon, they got someone who came out of the Republican Party and strong anti-communist credentials. At that point, Buckley became hugely influential, and the magazine did too, because it was the tip sheet. If Nixon wanted to keep his right wing behind him and in line, he needed Buckley to do it. So one of the paradoxes I found, we've talked about how my understanding of Buckley changed over time. I had thought, like so many, that the great culmination of Buckley's career was the election of Ronald Reagan in 1980. Sure. Well, that's true. But paradoxically, at that moment, Buckley became less necessary to the movement because they had their guy in the White House. So it was really under Nixon, the more centrist Republican, not quite trusted by the far right, that Buckley really flourished and National Review became essential reading. And then you begin to see the shift that comes with your own parties being in power from being kind of the hecklers and the peanut gallery to saying, well, we better have something to say about policy now because they're looking to us. We better actually think through the issues, which they hadn't done so much before.
Yes. You mentioned anti-communism. I want to jump on that point, Sam, because as you document it, it served as a kind of connective tissue for the conservative movement that Buckley was building. It was the glue that held together a broad and often diverse set of views, including on National Review's own masthead. How difficult has it been in hindsight to maintain that kind of unity in the absence of a shared cause like anti-communism? And what does it tell us about the challenges of holding together the different parts of the right today?
Well, I think what happened, Sean, was with anti-communism, they had a really broad and intellectually sustainable movement. So
Yes.
Buckley begins to seem like a major world historical figure with the rise of those great dissident intellectuals behind the Iron Curtain. When
Mm.
suddenly we've got a Solzhenitsyn and a Václav Havel, right? Or even in England, Tom Stoppard, right? Who came from the bounced check, as he called himself. These writers who gain international followings and prestige, intellectual and literary prestige, then the movement seems as if it's in the vanguard.
Yes.
But with the collapse, the end of communism, while the conservative movement still had its arguments, its crusades, and its beliefs, they begin to seem smaller. And I say in the book, the way I formulated it for myself was when Buckley coming of age in the 1950s and 60s, politics expressed itself through culture. So you wanted to defeat the liberals by out arguing them, so by out arguing them, out thinking and outwriting them, if you could do it.
Yes.
Well, by the time you get to the 1990s and the culture wars, then it's as if culture has almost become a substitute for politics. And
Mm.
politics just becomes the vehicle whereby you wage the kind of crusades we're seeing today.
Mm.
So some of the heirs of Buckley, to the extent there are any, because no one matches him just for breadth and scope and sheer brilliance, are the polemicists who are very good and skilled in many ways, have a much narrower focus. They've got their finger on the pulse of wokeism day and night, but maybe not on much else,
Yes.
right? So the movement in that sense, yes, it's still together. They agree. They know what they don't like, but somehow the thing they don't like feels less threatening than Stalin in Moscow.
Yes, well said. Um, One of the reasons I love these types of conversations, Sam, is they start to cohere uh, unintentionally. We've been talking so far about your book and what we learned about Buckley's politics and Buckley's life, and it seems to me at the heart of it are a series of paradoxes, and that brings us to the subject of race. Buckley's records here is complicated. He was drawn at times to black separatists like Malcolm X, and yet was highly critical of Martin Luther King Jr. He was famously opposed to the Civil Rights Act, and yet we learned through your book that his family had a reputation for treating black employees rather well, at least in relative terms. How do we make sense of that paradox? What explains Buckley's stances on race, and how would he have explained it to himself?
Well, I think that was one of the big questions for me. And so I like to think I'm a storyteller, and I walk you through it, and we draw our own conclusions. And I don't want to impose them on you, but here are some of the thoughts I came away
Please.
with. If you go back to this idea of Christian charity, then the Buckleys, as well-to-do and humane people and believing Catholics, have an obligation to help the less fortunate, disadvantaged, as they used to say back in the
Sure.
day, through acts of personal kindness and devotion to the higher laws of religious salvation. And so they became incredibly kind and generous. And his father paid uh, for young black people he knew to go to what we call, HBCUs, we call them here, historically black colleges and universities, at the same time that they're rigorously opposed to the Civil Rights Act, to integration. The father was a racist. He wanted to keep the races apart. It took Bill Buckley some time to overcome that. I found a letter in the Yale archives. It's kind of shocking on the topic of even interracial dancing of black and white students. Now, this is in the late 1940s. Those were not uncommon views for a Southerner. So how do you reconcile that with, in some ways, the more advanced views he had, or radical seeming support of a figure like Malcolm X? That one I got pretty easily, because if you are a segregationist, you really don't have a problem with black separatism.
Hmm.
They want to keep the races separate too. And what he liked about Malcolm X was the self-help aspect. What he distrusted in Dr. King, although he saw how eloquent he was and how powerful a Christian argument he made, was this idea of the term in those days was called race mixing. I mean, that's how people talked about it. And so Buckley is kind of caught between those things. What brings him around? Well, the same thing that brings most people around. It's not what he read, it's what he experienced in his life, you know.
Hmm.
And when he started meeting all sorts of gifted, talented, interesting, challenging Black Americans who could corner him in debate, like James Baldwin, then he starts to rethink. He starts to set aside some of the prejudices and starts to think instead, well, how can I, as a Catholic, make my contribution? And there it's to a kind of philanthropy and also his great power as a listener.
Hmm.
I found that the most important contribution Buckley made in race was just the guests he had on his program Firing Line.
Yes.
Jesse Jackson, Muhammad Ali. He really liked Muhammad Ali, liked his courage. He liked Jesse Jackson's power of argument. He had the Black Panthers on, Huey Newton and Eldridge Cleaver. So people on the left will say, if you want to know what the Black power advocates had to say back in the early 1970s, you have to go on Buckley's program to find it because he put them on. You know, he thought people should hear that they
Yes.
should not just see scary images on television. They should hear these guys and decide for themselves that they're trouble, which they were in many cases. But Buckley was willing to open up the microphone. You know, there was that sense of play he had and
Yes.
of fairness too. You have to let the other side have its say. And he thought his side would win. I mean, that's another aspect of, we could say, the faith too, Sean, is that he believed that he had the true religion on his side and the true
Yes.
politics on his side.
Yes. You rightly point out Buckley's remarkable eye for talent. David Brooks famously tells a story about Buckley seeking him out even after Brooks had poked fun at him. What was Buckley looking for when he went searching for young writers and thinkers, and what did he often find in them?
He wanted good writers, first of all, because he knew that's where his side was behind. You know, they could spell out an argument pretty well. The conservatives of his period of, you know, in the 40s and 50s, when, and including his mentor, some of them wrote well, but they didn't have the style, the flair that was emerging in journalism, really beginning in the late 1950s and through the 60s. So you see these remarkable talents, Gary Wills, Joan Didion, Arlene Croce, the great dance critic. They're writing criticism in National Review, and those are the pages that sang. He wanted his magazine to be fun to read.
Yes.
When I knew him, and I knew him for many years, the magazine he read most closely was The New Yorker. And his greatest accomplishment as a writer was when The New Yorker began to excerpt his own books, because
Hmm.
now he felt, well, he was in the company of the true writers. The only newspaper he read closely was the New York Times. He didn't read conservative newspapers or the conservative press. He published a great conservative magazine, but that's not where he looked for talent. So it had to be a kind of a verbal richness. There's a wonderful remark National Review's publisher, Bill Rusher, made about Buckley. Uh, and he said, it's a good thing the Communist Manifesto wasn't better written, or we might have lost Buckley. We might have lost Buckley, you know. And if Buckley had read a little more and read some of those overwhelmingly powerful chapters in Marx's Capital on child labor and such, maybe he would have gone over to the other side. But it was really talent he liked. He was a great spotter of talent.
Yes.
He was a musician, a pretty good harpsichordist and pianist. So he listened for the rhythm and music and prose. And he liked to paint. He wasn't much of a painter, but he liked to do it. So he had a visual sense. So you
Hmm.
put that plus storytelling together. Buckley's own best books, set aside the famous polemic, God Men at Yale, his best books are memoirs that
Yes.
just describe his buoyant, very adventurous life. He's a storyteller. So you have
Yes.
storytelling, the sound, the rhythm of beautiful language, and well-observed detail. That's what he was looking for in writers. So what he thought he could do, Sean, was bring a young one aboard, like a Gary Wills or John Leonard, who preceded me by a few editors in the job I had for a time as editor of the New York Times Book Review, but who started working for Buckley. And Buckley would say, okay, Leonard's a liberal, so we'll have to educate him in the politics, but let's get his good prose in the magazine, because that's what he thought he could do. And to
Yes.
some extent, he did. Leonard remained on the left, but he said till the end he learned from Bill Buckley.
Yes.
Gary Wills and George Will and Joan Didion all learned a lot from Buckley and the other thinkers at National Review. And he thought he could do that. If you think about it, it's similar to the project he's doing on a vast scale in the country. We are going to teach people the value of conservatism. We'll assume a lot of them are liberals, and we're going to have to bring them around. So you start with the people you hire in your magazine; they become the test cases in some way.
No, that's interesting. That's
Yeah.
you mentioned in the book that Buckley considered different possible successors, but didn't necessarily handle that process all that well. Can you talk about his efforts to hand over the reins of National Review? What does it tell us about his leadership style and his vision for the magazine's future?
Well, there's one story I didn't tell that I wish I had, although it's been told very well in a memoir by a guy who was passed over for the editorship. Wonderful writer at National Review named Richard Brookhiser. Rick
Yes,
Brookhiser.
it's a beautiful
Uh,
book.
and yes, and Rick told me the story in person when I interviewed him, but you can also find it in his own memoir, that Buckley had hired Brookhiser in the 1970s from Yale University. Rick was, like so many others, extremely precocious, kept him on through the 80s and said to him, someday you will be the editor of this magazine. And then he decided not to do it. He thought Brookhiser was more writer than ideologue, which is true. And he wasn't sure he had the administrative or executive skills to run what was by then a pretty big operation. You know, it's 40
Yes.
or 50 people, and there are other kind of ancillary projects that go with it. And so he gave it to another editor, a guy named John O'Sullivan, who was also a talented literary man and been a speechwriter for Margaret Thatcher. He gave it to him in the late 80s when Buckley decided to retire. He still was the presiding editor in most ways. He didn't run the magazine day to day, but he made the big decisions, Buckley himself. Then he decided it was time to get another editor. And younger conservatives and writers have told me they actually think this is maybe the most important discovery or revelation in the book, and I'm sensing you maybe feel this too, is in 1995, when Buckley was 70 and had been retired for a few years, doing all his other things, writing his spy novels and sailing memoirs and being on television, being a famous celebrity and very successful speaker and writer, but no longer so much in the movement. A new magazine had started in Washington called the Weekly Standard. National Review was published in New York. It still is. Buckley came out of a culture that was centered in New York, which tells you something about the change in where politics is.
Yes.
And he always wanted to keep it in New York. And he knew he needed to compete with the Weekly Standard, which was very much inside the conservative movement, had brilliant writers and editors, that he might want someone there to run the magazine. So he talked to two of its most talented writers. He got permission from the editor, Bill Kristol, William Kristol, the son of Bill Buckley's great friend, Irving Kristol. This
Yes.
is a family story, Sean. Readers will discover that very soon. The movement is a family movement, a conservative movement. So he went to Bill Kristol and said, can I talk to some of your stars? He said, yeah, go ahead, talk to anybody you want. So he singled out two people. One of them is David Brooks, who is probably as famous, what we'd call him kind of a centrist writer now, but really did come out of that conservative movement, not the fire-breathing side, but the argument intellectual side of the movement. And you're right, Buckley had met him, Brooks, when he was at the University of Chicago. And he'd written a very clever essay about Buckley. And And in that essay, David himself had forgotten till I sent him the original piece he wrote. He'd actually asked Buckley for a job in that essay. And everyone kind of forgets that because they remember that, as you said, it's kind of a slightly satirical, very
Yes.
cleverly written piece about Buckley. And so he talked to David Brooks and he talked to another brilliant Ivy League conservative, uh, whom I expect your listeners will know very well. He's a friend of mine, and I think maybe he's a friend of yours, the quite remarkable David Frum, who had made a sensation at Yale University as a conservative in the 1980s. And my understanding is, give a little new stuff here, it was Bill Buckley's son, Christopher,
Hmm.
the novelist and satirist, who's told him. Christopher was a counselor to Bill. It was Christopher who said to Bill that I might be a good biographer of him. He said to him, there's this guy, David Frum at Yale. You've got to read his stuff. He's that smart. And they were on his list. And then Buckley, while he was in Washington, met with another conservative eminence, George Will, the very famous Washington Post columnist, who had been at National Review, another of Buckley's many, many disciples. And in a memo I found in a very obscure place. It's not in Buckley's archive. It's not in any archive. It was in the private correspondence of someone I interviewed for Buckley, a good friend of his. Bill Buckley sent a memo to the board of National Review and said, I talked to George Will, and he agrees with me. The next editor of the magazine should be a believing Christian and an American. Well, David Brooks was Jewish. That's one strike. David Frum had two strikes. He's from Canada. Doesn't matter that he's a Tory, you know. And so they settled instead on Rich Lowry, who was a very talented young journalist in their Washington bureau. But I think Rich himself would say, he's not David Brooks and he's not David Frum. And here's something else I'll tell you that's not in the book. Buckley talked about that with me at the time. I knew him very well by the 90s
Yes.
and 1990s, and this was in 1997, just when the Chambers book came out, right?
Yes.
Which Buckley was a supporter of and was important in that world, I think. And all the young people read it. Young people are now, they're 60 years old, but they were young back then when the book came out. And Buckley said, well, what do you think? And I said, I kind of think David Brooks is your guy. He's really smart. He's a really good writer. Now, would David Brooks have taken the job? My guess is no. He was then he'd gone to the Wall Street Journal and then the Weekly Standard. He was making his name as a writer. He'd had a bestseller called Bobo's in Paradise, which not many people remember, but was actually quite a sensation in its time. I doubt whether he would have taken the job. So the next question is, would David Frum have taken it? I've never asked him the question, so I'm going to wait till we do a conversation in a format kind of like this. And I'm going to ask him, David, would you have accepted the job? David, was floored when he read this. And I think, I don't want to overstate, I don't want to self-aggrandize, but I think some of the sounds from the crows and jays, we'll call them, who are heckling a little bit about this book, comes out of that particular one.
Interesting.
Yeah, there's a really talented Washington journalist, Robert Costa, who
Sure.
yeah,
Yes.
who was at the Washington Post.
And worked at National Review previously.
You're one of the few people who know that.
Yes.
That Robert Costa started at National Review. And he said when he saw that in the book, we did a thing, he has a program on CBS News. He's now their chief political correspondent. We did a little segment on my book and Buckley on TV. And he said when he read that, he thought, that answers a question about where the magazine went. Now, I don't know if that's really fair, but I know what he means because we look at the landscape now. We look where these different players are kind of arrayed, and we say, well, we kind of know what David Frum thinks, and we kind of know what David Brooks thinks, and we kind of know what Rich Lowry thinks, and they're in very different places. So, it's an open question what difference it would have made, but it could be that it was very important, at least to that particular slice of the movement. Because it's also, I think, important for us to say that, yeah, you and I love this stuff, Sean. We love the ideas, and we know the names, and we know the thinkers. This is not a moment where that's necessarily paramount. So,
Yes.
National Review is still important in its way, but as other publications are, right and left, but they don't have the prestige they did them, simply because the culture has changed.
That seems like a good spot to wrap up what's been part one of our two-part conversation with Sam Tanenhaus about his must-read biography of William F. Buckley Jr. entitled Buckley, The Life and Revolution That Changed America. Check in tomorrow for part two of our ongoing conversation where we'll discuss, amongst other things, Buckley's connection to Canada. Thank you so much. Bye-bye. This video has been brought to you by Airbnb. Thank you, Airbnb, for sponsoring the Hub's YouTube channel this month. Governments, as Hub listeners and viewers know, are rightly focused on addressing Canada's housing crisis. But when they spend their time regulating short-term rentals like Airbnb, they're not focused on what matters most. According to Statistics Canada, the number of short-term rentals that could be potentially converted into long-term homes is just 0.6%. Yet Canada needs almost 6 million new homes by 2030 to achieve affordability. A closer look tells us that clearly building more homes, not regulating or restricting short-term rentals, is the only real solution. Learn more at airbnb.ca/closer look.